Looking back now, I can see the cracks were there long before I paid them any attention. We were that couple everyone assumed was perfectly content. We had a good life, a nice house, vacations when we wanted them, and the kind of relationship that, at least on the surface, seemed solid. Savannah and I had been together for years, and it wasn't like things had gone sour overnight. But over time, that closeness faded. I started noticing it subtle at first. She'd be less interested in the little moments we used to share, and there was this growing distance between us. I thought maybe we'd hit a bit of a rut, that maybe we'd been too comfortable for too long. I figured every couple goes through that now, and then along came Kale. I'll admit, the first time I invited him over, it was purely professional. Savannah and I were looking to branch out with our finances, and he came recommended by a friend. He seemed competent enough, confident in a way that was almost magnetic, not the flashy kind, but you could tell he knew how to handle himself. I noticed that Savannah was paying more attention than usual, though. Normally, when it came to anything finance-related, her eyes would glaze over. But here she was leaning forward, her eyes locked on him as he talked about investment strategies. I remember thinking, well, this is new. But hey, if she was genuinely interested in understanding the finances, I wasn't going to stand in her way. A few days later, they started texting. And it wasn't like I was spying. I'm not that kind of guy. But when your wife is practically glued to her phone, chuckling over God knows what while sitting across the room, it's hard not to notice. I asked her about it, and she brushed it off, saying it was just Kale sharing some tips, and that he has this way of explaining things. I told myself not to make a big deal out of it. She's just interested in learning, I thought. But I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like something just didn't add up. Then she suggested we invite him out for dinner. Said it was to thank him for his help, which, okay, I could get behind. It felt like a bit much, but maybe I was just being overly sensitive. We went to this nice place downtown. Savannah dressed up a little more than usual, and when Kale showed up, she lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. As the night went on, she laughed at everything he said, complimented his insight, his unique perspective. At one point, she even leaned across the table to tell him how impressive his achievements were, her eyes practically sparkling. I watched, biting my tongue, hoping I was overthinking things. But it was hard not to feel like a third wheel. And then there was Ivy. Now, Ivy was Savannah's closest friend, but I'd always found her a little, let's just say, morally flexible. She'd had her fair share of flings, even when her boyfriend was just down the hall. So, when I overheard Ivy telling Savannah to refresh her life a little, I knew exactly what she was getting at. And Savannah, instead of shutting her down, was smiling, like she was actually considering it. Joking or not, it set off an alarm in my head. I didn't want to believe that Savannah would ever stray, but there were these moments, these tiny things that started to build up. Savannah's late nights at book club, which somehow got longer each week. The way she casually mentioned something Kale said, dropping his name into conversations as if he were just a harmless friend. I could see the shift in her, this odd excitement whenever he came up. I asked her one night, trying to keep it light. So, Kale seems to be making quite an impression on you, huh? She laughed it off, rolling her eyes. Oh, don't be paranoid, she said, brushing my question away like it was nothing. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't ignore the way she'd look at him, her eyes lingering a little too long, her smile a little too wide. It was in those small moments that I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, jealousy. And not just the regular kind. This was the type that gnaws at you, that makes you replay every interaction in your head until you're practically unraveling. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, seeing them together like that. That was the moment my world cracked wide open. I tried to hold it together, just to make it through the drive home, but my mind was a mess. I was replaying every interaction, every laugh she shared with Kale, every sideways glance she gave me when I questioned her. The closer I got to home, the angrier I became, and by the time I parked, I felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. I had so many questions spinning around in my head, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this bottled up without confronting her. That evening, when she finally got home, she acted like it was any other day. She barely looked at me as she tossed her bag on the table and went to grab a glass of wine. My blood was boiling, but I tried to keep it together. I couldn't just throw accusations around without giving her a chance to explain, right? So I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, "Hey, you mentioned you were going out with Ivy today, right?" She paused for a second, then casually nodded. "Yeah, we were supposed to, but she got busy, so I just grabbed lunch on my own." I was stunned. She lied to my face without even flinching. My mind was screaming at me to just confront her, to tell her I knew she'd been out with Kale. But instead, I forced myself to nod and let it go. I didn't want her to know I was on to her yet. I wanted to catch her in a lie, one she couldn't brush off as paranoia. So I pretended everything was fine, even though every time she looked at me, all I could see was her with him, laughing like they were sharing some inside joke that didn't include me. Over the next few days, the distance between us only grew wider. She became colder, more withdrawn, almost like she'd forgotten I existed. The nights that used to be filled with conversation and laughter turned into this eerie silence. I'd try to talk to her, but she'd either shrug me off or give short, clipped responses. It was like living with a stranger. And the more I watched her, the more I noticed things that hadn't bothered me before. Like the way she'd always keep her phone angled away from me, or how she'd get these mysterious calls in the middle of the evening and step out of the room to answer. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on, so I asked her straight out, "What's going on with you and Kale?" I tried to sound casual, like I wasn't accusing her of anything, but she froze. For a split second, I saw something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or fear. But then she laughed it off. "Oh, please, don't tell me you're getting jealous over Kale. He's just a friend." She said it with that same dismissive tone she'd used before, like I was crazy for even suggesting it. "You're just being paranoid," she added, rolling her eyes and going back to scrolling through her phone. But I wasn't paranoid. I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't the only one who'd noticed something was off. A couple of days after our argument, Fur called me up, saying he wanted to meet for a drink. I could tell from his tone that it wasn't just a casual invite. When I got to the bar, he was already waiting, nursing his drink like he had something on his mind. We sat down, exchanged a few pleasantries, but I could feel this heavy tension between us. Finally, he looked me in the eye and said, "Look, man, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw Savannah out with Kale again. It didn't look like a business meeting, if you know what I mean." Hearing it from someone else, that was the nail in the coffin. Ford wasn't the type to stir up drama. If he was bringing this up, then there was no mistaking it. They were together, laughing and leaning close, completely oblivious to anyone around them. Ford tried to soften the blow, saying maybe I should talk to Savannah about it, give her a chance to explain, but I could barely hear him over the pounding in my head. All I could think about was her betrayal, how she'd been slipping away from me, right into the arms of some guy who barely knew her. A few days later, the universe threw me a twisted kind of gift. I had to come home early, and as I drove through downtown, I saw them again. They were just stepping out of a restaurant, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. She had this glow about her, the kind I hadn't seen in years, like she was a teenager in love for the first time. I watched as she leaned into him, her hand brushing his arm, and the way he looked at her, it made me sick. This wasn't just a friend. This was something more, something deeper, something I'd been too blind to see for too long. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with anger, hurt, and a sick kind of clarity. The pieces were falling into place, and for the first time, I couldn't deny what was right in front of me. My wife was cheating on me, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Every laugh, every touch, every shared look, it all played in my head like a twisted movie, each scene a dagger that twisted deeper. When she got home that evening, I wanted to scream, to confront her, to lay it all out, but I held back. I needed to know just how deep this went. There's a point where suspicion and doubt start eating away at you, turning every thought into a knife. I couldn't go on like that, guessing, questioning, replaying every moment in my head. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. It felt like admitting defeat, like I was letting some stranger into the most private parts of my life. But I was out of options. I couldn't just sit there, watching her drift further away while this sick game went on behind my back. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The investigator was discreet, professional, and he didn't ask questions. I didn't give him the whole story, just enough for him to understand that I needed concrete proof of whatever was going on between Savannah and Cale. And within a week, he delivered. I still remember that day, sitting in his dimly lit office as he slid a manila folder across the table. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a stack of photos that confirmed everything I'd feared. The first one hit me like a punch to the gut. Savannah and Cale, sitting at a candlelit dinner, their hands entwined across the table. I stared at the image, my mind numb with shock. They looked happy, intimate, like a couple who had nothing to hide. She was leaning forward, her eyes bright, a smile on her face that I hadn't seen in years. It was like she'd saved that part of herself for him, leaving me with the hollow shell of a woman who used to be my wife. There were more photos. Some were of them walking together, their bodies close, her head tilted up towards him, as if he was the only thing in the world she cared about. I could feel my heart splintering with every new image. And then, as if that wasn't enough, there were videos too. Clips of them at various spots, talking, laughing, even touching. One particular clip showed her reaching across to hold his hand, and he didn't pull away. They weren't hiding, not even trying to be subtle. It was a blatant betrayal, right there for anyone to see. The investigator watched me in silence as I went through the evidence. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, breaking the silence. I nodded, but I couldn't find words. The truth was, I didn't want his sympathy. I wanted answers, justice, a way to make this pain stop. But sympathy? That wouldn't change anything. The whole drive home, I felt like I was caught in some surreal nightmare. Every image from that folder was seared into my brain, each one a fresh reminder of how deeply she'd betrayed me. I knew I couldn't confront her right away. I needed a plan, something that would make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. I couldn't let her walk away unscathed. That's when I decided to call Evan. Evan and I went way back. We'd worked together in investments years ago, and he knew the ins and outs of finance like nobody else. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, but he was one of the few people I trusted. When I explained the situation to him, he didn't hesitate. "We'll set up a new account," he said, his tone cool and calculating. "Something she won't have access to. If she's been using your money to fuel this affair, we'll make sure she has nothing left to fall back on." Over the next few days, Evan and I worked out the details. We set up a discrete account and started reallocating funds bit by bit, making it look like a smart investment move. Savannah, always keen on appearances, was more than happy to go along with it. When I told her it was a strategy to secure our family's future, she didn't bat an eye. "That sounds smart," she said with a nod, completely unaware that I was pulling the rug out from under her. I could almost feel a twisted sense of satisfaction watching her sign off on it, trusting me to take care of our finances while she went off to enjoy her double life. Once the financials were set, I shifted my focus to her. I started pulling back, avoiding her whenever possible. I knew it would unsettle her, make her question what was going on. Whenever she tried to initiate a conversation, I'd give her one-word answers, my tone cold and detached. I didn't ask about her day, didn't show any interest in her plans. At night, I'd turn away from her, leaving her to lie awake, probably wondering what had changed. I wanted her to feel the distance she'd created, to realize that I wasn't the fool she'd taken me for. It didn't take long for her to notice. She'd watch me over dinner, her eyes searching my face as if trying to figure out what was wrong. "Is everything okay?" she asked one night, her tone uncertain. I shrugged, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Yeah, just busy with work." She didn't press, but I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. I could see that she was starting to feel it, that gnawing anxiety I'd been living with for weeks. It was a small victory, but it felt good to watch her squirm. Over the next few days, she started making more of an effort, trying to bridge the gap between us. But I wasn't interested. Every time she tried to get close, I'd pull back, leaving her confused and frustrated. And the best part? She had no idea why. She'd chosen to play her games with Cale, and now she was feeling the consequences. Once I had the financial side locked down, I knew it was time to set things in motion. The truth was, I wasn't just going to let Savannah walk away from this unscathed. I wanted her to feel the sting of betrayal, to understand the depth of the wound she'd left me with. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed support, allies who understood why this was more than just a petty revenge plot. It was a reckoning. The first person I told was Ford. He'd been there from the beginning, the first to raise the alarm, and I knew he'd back me up. We met up at our usual bar, and as soon as I started explaining my plan, he leaned in, nodding in quiet agreement. "You're doing the right thing, man," he said, his voice low and steady. "She deserves to be exposed." Ford's words grounded me, reinforcing my conviction. I could see in his eyes that he didn't think I was crazy. He knew, just as I did, that Savannah had crossed the line, and there was no going back. Over the next few days, I confided in a couple of other close friends, people I trusted to keep quiet. Each of them listened, their reactions a mix of shock and anger. They knew Savannah as my wife, the woman who'd once been my partner. Hearing about the double life she'd been living with Cale stirred something in all of them, a sense of betrayal, like they too had been deceived. We planned everything carefully, talking through the details until each piece fell perfectly into place. Meanwhile, Savannah was growing increasingly unsettled by my coldness. She'd watch me across the dinner table, her expression torn between curiosity and frustration. I could feel her trying to read me, trying to figure out what had changed. I could almost laugh at the irony. She was feeling the same uncertainty, the same suspicion I'd been living with for weeks. One evening, I overheard her talking on the phone with Cale. She was whispering, her voice tinged with a nervous edge I hadn't heard before. "I don't know Cale," she said, barely audible from the other room. "He's just different, distant." Cale, always the smooth talker, assured her that it was only a matter of time. "Soon," he said, "we'll be together. No more secrets, no more sneaking around." I clenched my fists, letting his words fuel the fire in me. They thought they'd won. They thought they were going to ride off into the sunset, leaving me in the dust. But they had no idea what was coming. That's when I came up with the idea of the financial party. It was the perfect way to lure them in, to make them drop their guard. I sent out invitations to mutual friends, acquaintances, even some of Savannah's close friends who had no idea what was really going on. I presented it as an event to showcase a new investment opportunity, making it sound just formal enough to keep people curious, but not suspicious. I made sure to mention Cale specifically, knowing that Savannah wouldn't miss the chance to bring him along. After all, she was probably eager to show him off in front of our friends, to flaunt the fact that her little secret was still safe. The night of the party, I went all out. I hired a caterer, set up a bar, and decorated our house as if it were some grand unveiling. I wanted the whole thing to feel polished, expensive, like the life she'd gotten used to. I even dressed up for the occasion, putting on the suit she'd always liked, the one that made me look like someone she'd once fallen in love with. As guests started arriving, I greeted them with a warm smile, the perfect host. I could see some of them glancing around, curious, maybe sensing the underlying tension. Ford was there, too, giving me a subtle nod, his expression one of steady support. It felt like a calm before the storm, like we were all waiting for something to break. And then she arrived. Savannah walked in with Cale by her side, dressed to the nines, her arm linked through his in a way that was almost brazen. I could see the way they looked at each other, their shared glances, the subtle touches they thought no one else noticed. They were comfortable, almost cocky, assuming I was still in the dark. She looked at me, smiling that fake, practice smile she'd perfected over the years, and I returned it, matching her charm with a confidence I hadn't felt in a long time. I could tell it threw her off. She hadn't expected me to look so composed, so unaffected. As the evening wore on, I watched them from across the room, my heart pounding as they mingled with our friends, laughing and chatting as if they didn't have a care in the world. I let them think they'd won, that they were safe, that I was oblivious to everything that had been going on. Savannah and Cale were reveling in their illusion, so lost in their own little world that they didn't even notice the knowing glances Ford was exchanging with me. I waited, biding my time, letting them relax, letting them feel like they'd pulled one over on me. Finally, as the night was winding down, I stepped up to make my announcement. I cleared my throat, the room quieting as everyone turned to look at me. I kept my gaze steady, my tone calm, and thanked everyone for coming, saying I had something special to share. Savannah and Kale were standing near the front, watching with faint amusement, as if they were in on some private joke. They had no idea that the joke was about to be on them. And as I looked at them, my heart pounding with a mix of fury and satisfaction, I knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I took a slow, deep breath, looking out at the faces of my friends, my colleagues, even Savannah's friends who had been fooled into thinking she was the perfect wife. I knew that after tonight, everything would change. With one hand, I picked up a small remote and clicked a button, dimming the lights in the room. A projector whirred to life, casting an image on the wall behind me. I wanted to share something personal with all of you, I said, keeping my tone steady, even though my heart was pounding. Something I think you all deserve to know. The first photo appeared, a candid shot of Savannah and Kale at that candlelit dinner, their hands intertwined. A murmur ran through the crowd as people looked from the screen to Savannah and back again, processing what they were seeing. Savannah's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if she were struggling for words. Kale took a step back, his expression shifting from confusion to panic as more images appeared, each one more damning than the last. I didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch out as the weight of their betrayal sank in. Then, as the last image faded, I turned to face her. "Savannah," I said, my voice sharp and unyielding. "You lied to me, to our friends, and to everyone who thought they knew you." Her eyes widened, and she stammered, trying to explain, but I raised a hand to stop her. Don't even try to talk your way out of this. You've been cheating on me with him," I pointed to Kale, "and you didn't even have the decency to hide it. You flaunted it, right in front of me like I was too stupid to see it." She looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face as if searching for someone to defend her, but all she saw were expressions of shock and disgust. It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." "Rylan, please, you have to understand." "Understand?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You betrayed me, Savannah. You took what we had, everything we built, and threw it away for him. And not only that," I continued, "you were using my money to fund your little affair, weren't you? Do you think I didn't know? All those dinners, the gifts, the nights out, I paid for every single one." She flinched, and for the first time, I saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes. Kale was standing there, frozen, realizing the impact of what I just said. Some of the guests were his clients, and they were already exchanging glances, their faces a mix of anger and disappointment. Kale, who'd always been so smooth, so confident, was suddenly aware of how precarious his situation was. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built was crumbling right in front of him, all because he couldn't keep his hands off another man's wife. One of his clients, a man I knew well, stepped forward and shook his head, disgust plain on his face. "I trusted you, Kale," he said, his tone icy. "But I can't do business with someone who has no respect for boundaries, or for the people he works with." One by one, other clients followed suit, some murmuring to each other, others simply leaving, as if the mere sight of him was repellent. Kale's face turned white, and he opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Savannah, then back at me, as if hoping for some way out, some miracle that would undo the mess he'd created. But there was no way out, and he knew it. Savannah, desperate, tried again to speak. "Rylan, please, we could talk about this. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her voice was breaking, her hands reaching out as if to pull me back into her web of lies and manipulation. But I was done. I was beyond saving, beyond forgiveness. All I felt was a cold satisfaction as I looked her in the eye. "I'm filing for divorce," I announced, my voice clear and unyielding. "And don't think for a second that you're going to get anything from me. I've already secured my assets. You'll have nothing." Her face crumpled, her expression shifting from shock to panic as she realized the full extent of what she'd lost. "You betrayed me, Savannah. You took my trust, my money, everything we shared, and you destroyed it. You made your bed. Now you can lie in it." There was silence as the weight of my words settled over the room, punctuated only by Savannah's quiet, broken sobs. I looked around at our guests, at the faces of friends who now knew the truth. "I'm sorry you had to see this," I said, nodding to the people who had been there for me, the ones who'd stood by me through it all. But I thought it was time everyone knew who Savannah really is. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her world shattered, her lover disgraced, and the life she'd taken for granted crumbling around her. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. Savannah's fall was immediate and brutal. After the divorce, she was stripped of everything she'd taken for granted. Her polished social circle, the friends who'd once admired her, now kept their distance, avoiding her like she was carrying something contagious. People whispered about her betrayal, her affair, the way she'd flaunted it without shame. At first, she tried to save face, pretending nothing had changed, keeping up her manicured appearances as though nothing had happened. But the calls stopped coming. Invitations dried up. Her social media, once buzzing with interactions, grew quieter each day. Savannah, who thrived on attention and admiration, found herself alone, her so-called friends seeing her now as little more than a cautionary tale. The financial blow hit her harder than she'd likely anticipated. For the first time in her life, she didn't have anyone to support her. She tried to reach out, making a couple of desperate calls to me, but I didn't answer. Her emails went straight to the trash folder without a second glance. I knew her too well. I could practically predict the words she'd use to justify herself, to twist the situation into some narrative where she wasn't the villain. But I had no interest in hearing her excuses, her rationalizations, her pleas for understanding. She'd made her choices, burned the bridge between us, and now she was finally feeling the heat. And then there was Cale. His downfall was almost poetic in its irony. The clients he'd lost at the party were only the beginning. Word spread fast in our circles, and soon enough his entire reputation was in shambles. It didn't take long before he had to resign, taking a lower position at a lesser-known firm just to keep afloat. I heard through the grapevine that he'd eventually moved to another city, hoping to leave the scandal behind him. But no matter where he went, he couldn't shake the stigma. He was always going to be the guy who couldn't keep things professional, the guy who ruined his own life over a fling. His perfect romance with Savannah had vanished in a blink. He cut ties with her the minute his career started to suffer, leaving her as abruptly as he'd entered her life. Meanwhile, my life took an entirely different path. The investment I'd secured began to yield returns faster than I'd expected. Every milestone, every profit felt like a confirmation that I was on the right track, that I'd turned the worst chapter of my life into something that actually benefited me. The business was more than just a financial gain. It was something I'd built on my own, a reminder that I was stronger than I'd ever realized. Each successful venture reinforced that I'd come out on top, that I'd survived and thrived in ways Savannah would never understand. And it wasn't only about the money. There was a pride in knowing I'd taken control, that I hadn't let her betrayal destroy me. I was carving out a new future, one that was mine and mine alone. Ford and my other friends were a constant support throughout it all. Ford, especially, had been there through the worst of it, guiding me when I couldn't see the way forward. Our regular meetups became a lifeline, a reminder of the loyalty and honesty I'd found in my friends, the people who'd stood by me even when my own marriage had been built on lies. Ford's unwavering presence helped me regain my balance, reminding me that true friendship doesn't falter in times of crisis. With every toast, every quiet nod of support, I felt pieces of myself being rebuilt stronger than before. These people, these real friends, they kept me grounded, pulling me back from the edge and helping me find my footing again. Looking back, I realized that everything I'd been through had forced me to see the truth. I'd been so wrapped up in keeping up appearances that I'd overlooked what mattered most: honesty, trust, and respect. Savannah's betrayal shattered that illusion, forcing me to confront my own choices, my own willingness to turn a blind eye for the sake of comfort. But now, after enduring the pain, the heartbreak, the gut-wrenching moments of realization, I knew I'd come out the other side with a strength I'd never known. I'd faced the worst and survived it, and in doing so, I'd found something priceless, a chance to rebuild, to start over on a foundation of truth and integrity. Now, Standing on the other side of it all, I feel a calm I didn't think was possible. I'm free. Free from the deception, the manipulation, the emptiness of a marriage that had become nothing but a hollow shell. And as I look forward, I feel a quiet satisfaction, a deep sense of peace in knowing that I'm finally able to live on my own terms. The past may have scarred me, but it also shaped me, teaching me lessons I won't soon forget. The pain, the betrayal, it was worth it because it gave me the strength to create a life that's truly mine. And that's a freedom I wouldn't trade for anything.